Virtue ethics. We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit. Virtue ethics is one of the three approaches to normative ethics. The other two are deontology and consequentialism. These number two and number three moral approaches ask the question, what should I do? In the case of deontology, what duty do I have to certain rules? With regard to consequentialism, what is my consideration of the outcome of my act or my response to a moral dilemma? So while these approaches ask, what should I do? Virtue ethics is unique in that it asks, what kind of person should I be? The idea is that virtues of mind and character can be trained in order to deal with moral dilemmas. This has a lot to do with the term arete, which is a Greek word meaning moral virtue or excellence of any kind. This term goes back to the poems of Homer, who used the term arete to focus on bravery and also with reference to being effective or having the most strength, bravery, and wit or intelligence to achieve efficient results, often in cases of Greek and Trojan heroes, which were actually female as well as male. This term can mean virtue is knowledge, or arete is knowledge, and Aristotle often referred to contemplation as being the highest human ability and a movement towards gaining happiness. Virtue ethics begins with the assumption that if one has good intentions and if a person is guided by habitually ingrained and good training with regards to good virtues, that the appropriate or morally correct action will follow. In other words, these virtues are habits. Much like the ancient Greeks believed in training the intellect and training the body, they also believed in training the moral structure, so one would be ready when dealing with moral dilemmas. The first three major virtue philosophers were Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Socrates lived from 470 to 399 BC. He is regarded as the first great philosopher and one of the founders of Western philosophy. His writings were passed down to Plato and, of course, Aristotle and a number of other philosophers. And he spent his whole life in Athens. There is very little known about his actual life, where he was born, his family of origin, etc. And a great number of his works were actually passed down to Plato, who then wrote them in essays or longer forms. Socrates actually used what's called the Socratic method. It's a tool that is still used in pedagogy or teaching today, in which the lecturer or teacher does not just stand up in front of the class and lecture, but rather poses a series of questions designed to help an individual or a group determine their underlying beliefs and the extent of their knowledge. Socrates would often pretend to be rather stupid and act like he didn't know anything in order to pose these questions to people, and by the end of the time that he had posed the questions, the person would often be confused about their beliefs and have to go back and think some more. With regard to Socrates as a person, as I said, we don't know too much about him. We know that he had a very brilliant intellect. There's also some references to him being an ugly fellow, not that physically attractive. He made no writings during his lifetime, and he was executed by being forced to drink hemlock, which is a poison. He was found guilty of corrupting the minds of the youth of Athens and not believing in the gods of the state. He was, during his trial for heresy and corrupting the minds, Socrates told jurors that they should be concerned about the welfare of their souls rather than issues of family, careers, and politics. He believed that the best way for people to live was the pursuit of virtue rather than the pursuit of things like material wealth. and he also believed that one should concentrate on friendship and a true sense of community in order to live a moral life. For this reason, when Socrates was given the death penalty, and he did have a chance to escape Athens, he did not leave, because he thought that that would go against the will of the community and would go against his philosophical teachings. These were abstract teachings, but Socrates, like a number of other virtues ethicists, believed that they had real-world applications. One of his famous quotes of Socrates was, "The unexamined life is not worth living, and ethical virtue is the only thing that matters." A student of Socrates was Plato. Once again, Plato's birth and origin story is not really well known. It's estimated that he lived from 428 to 348 BC. And there is some speculation that he came from a rich or influential family. Unlike Socrates, who never left Athens, Plato may have traveled to Italy, Egypt, Sicily, and some other countries, to return to Athens at the age of 40, in which he developed organized schools or academies for thinkers. This was known as the first institution of higher learning in the Western world, and unlike a lot of his contemporary philosophers, his work extended for a great period of time up until now. Most of it is assumed to have survived intact, and one of these reasons is because he founded the schools and it was kept at the school. Plato laid the very foundations of Western philosophy and science, and descriptions of his death are varied. There's some speculation that it was a natural death, some other beliefs that it was not. He wrote several works, one of which is The Republic, and in this work Plato suggested that societies have three class structures, and that this responds to the appetite, spirits, and reasoning structure of the individual soul. That is, in the individual of each of us, we have an appetite, a spirit, and a sense of reason or a rationale. To Plato, these three classes consisted of what he called the productive. This was the workers, and this was the appetite part of the soul. This included laborers, carpenters, plumbers, masons, merchants, farmers, ranchers, etc. The next group is what he called the protective group. This included warriors or guardians, what we would call today the armed forces. And he believed that this was the spirit part of the soul. This belonged to those who were adventurous, strong, and brave. And the smallest group he called the governing. This was rulers, or what he called philosopher kings. This corresponded to the reason part of the soul, and Plato argued that people in this position should be intelligent, rational, have a lot of self-control, and have a desire to pursue wisdom and be suited to making moral decisions for the community. Once again, Plato also referenced parts of the soul in terms of the human body, stating that reason, or the philosopher king, was located in the head. Spirit, or the armed forces, were located in the top third of the torso, and appetite, or the workers, in the middle third of the torso, down to the navel. Plato argued that the principles of democracy, as they existed in Athens, focused on reason and wisdom, not politics, rhetoric, and persuasion. For this reason, he endorsed philosopher kings who he believed should be trained very highly in terms of moral philosophy, and should be trained in terms of following the truth and making the appropriate decisions. One of the quotes by Plato in The Republic is, "Until philosophers rule as kings, or those who are now called kings and leading men genuinely and adequately philosophize, that is, until political power and philosophy entirely coincide, while the many natures who at present pursue either one exclusively are forcibly prevented from doing so, cities will have no rest from evils, nor, I think, will the human race." Here Plato is saying that politics should be entirely governed by these philosopher kings who have received virtue training and are the best people to make the decision. He had the analogy of a captain who was in charge of a ship, having the necessary skill set. In this case, the philosopher king would have the necessary skill set in terms of virtue ethics. Next in line was Aristotle, who was a lifelong student of Plato. He lived from 384 to 322 BC. At about the age of 17 or 18, he joined Plato's academy in Athens, and he was there for about 20 years. During this time, he wrote on a great number of topics and even added to them. Physics, biology, logic, poetry, theatre, music, psychology, linguistics, politics, government. He even dabbled and contributed greatly to issues like astronomy, anatomy, geography, physics, as I said, and meteorology. So there wasn't very many fields that he didn't touch, and he considered each of these topics to be important. He also wrote a great deal about moral philosophy. After his absence from Athens and some of his travels, he returned to Athens. He made his own school there, and he taught school at that time. He's also known famously to be a tutor for Alexander the Great as he was a young man, and this is an example of training a philosopher king to lead a state, an army, or a government. He believed that people's concepts and knowledge was based on perceptions, and he was interested in that idea. About 1/3 of all of his output does survive and is read today. This includes work such as physics, metaphysics, politics, and the Nicomachean Ethics. Following his death, there was some sentiment against Macedonians, which he was a Macedonian, and he was denounced and given a potential death penalty. Aristotle did flee, and he said, "I will not allow the Athenians to sin twice against philosophy," referring to the previous death of Socrates. As I said, it's believed that he died of natural causes, and he left a will, etc., to his philosopher students who still communicated with him. All of these three great philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, believed that ethics was a practical rather than just an abstract theoretical model. It was one aimed at becoming good and doing good rather than having knowledge about philosophy and moral philosophy for some sort of theoretical reason. The Nicomachean Ethics remains as a very important work in terms of virtue ethics. And in this book, Aristotle argued that in order to live a virtuous and happy life, one must train one's character habitually by teachers and also with the inclusion of life experiences in order to do the correct things in the correct time. Aristotle also believed that the best and most moral people combine their practical wisdom or their life experiences with their intellect or their rationale, and that these two things went together to create human virtue. The Nicomachean Ethics was written by Aristotle. It was originally about 10 books or scrolls, and it is understood that it was based on notes from his lecture while he was at the school. A great deal of earlier work, such as Socrates, was never actually written down. It was, in fact, written by Plato later on and was based on lectures and the questions that were asked. And the assumption is this book is fairly similar in terms of it being the product of some lectures and some discussions. It's noted that during the time slavery, women and children were given an inferior role in society. And in this book, Aristotle goes into quite a lot of detail about not only moral philosophy, but also issues of law and theology. It's essentially the first book on this ethical approach. And in the approach, Aristotle defines virtue as a habit of choice and brings up the observation of the mean or moderation in terms of making prudent moral decisions. This, of course, is placed in a context of how one lives, but looking at how decisions should be focused on the mean or a sense of moderation. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle starts with a number of questions. He starts out with the assumption that animals do not seem to have the same considerations that humans have. Animals seem to be motivated by behavioral instincts, fright and flight, whereas humans seem to have an understanding of life, sex, and death. And this made humans somewhat unique from other things on the earth. Aristotle thought that virtue had to do with the proper function or ergon of a thing, in terms of an eye being judged as to be a good eye as how much it does its proper function, which is sight. An eyesight that is not good is not doing its proper function. So Aristotle begins with the question, what is the function of things around us? What is the function of a chair, a dog, a bird, mountain, anything? What is the function of these things? And the question is such as, what is the function of a chair? You may say a chair is something I sit on. A chair has 4 legs. You get to the root function fairly quickly. Aristotle reasoned that humans must have a function that is specific to humans, and this function must be an activity of the soul in accordance with reason. So he deliberated for some time about what is the essential function of humans. And the question is, why do we do things? So for anything that one does, the question is why. So someone may ask you, why do you drive your car today? And you would say, well, I had to go to work. And then they would say, why do you go to work? And you could say, because I have to make money. And then they would say, well, why do you have to make money? Well, I have to buy food and clothes. Or why do you have to do those things? Well, because they make me happy. They encourage me to survive and live my life, but they make me happy. To Aristotle, this was the ultimate answer to any question to do with humans. It makes me happy. Happiness is translated as eudaimonia, which is the word you see here. Sometimes this eudaimonia word can mean happiness. It's also translated as well-being. And I've also seen it translated as flourishing, in terms of you are flourishing to your full potential. So in the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle first talks about this eudaimonia and a movement towards happiness and flourishing. And then he discusses this idea of the concept of the middle or moderation. Aristotle states that virtue is actually the middle position between 2 vices. That's his definition. For example, courage is a virtue in our society, but too much courage is seen as rashness or impulsiveness, and too little courage, you could be seen as a coward. And so you can see that the 2 vices of rashness and being a coward are the extremes of these behaviors. The middle area of these 2 extremes is courage, which is actually a virtue. So moral training would enable you to hit this mean or middle zone between the 2 extremes. Virtue meaning seeking the mean, or not having any deficits, or not having any excesses. Of course, this requires constant practice in the real world, and Aristotle also did point out that there had to be some sort of context. For example, a soldier would be encouraged to have more rashness or more elevated courage compared to regular society, whereas someone who was the philosopher king should probably have less impulsiveness and be more deliberating. So context was important. However, there was still this seeking the mean idea in order to live a virtuous life. Aristotle believed that in this practice, one could blend intellect with morals to create eudaimonia, or a happy life. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle also identifies 10 moral virtues. Remember, for each of these virtues, there's an excess or a deficit that's a vice. We already discussed courage, but you could see the same things could happen for temperance, prudence, justice, pride, ambition, good temper, being a good friend, truthfulness, and wittiness. Aristotle drilled these down to 4 essential or cardinal virtues of temperance, courage, prudence, and justice. A great number of this type of thinking has been adopted into religious texts. St. Thomas Aquinas was one of the first and most major of the religious scholars to adopt the issue of moral virtues and incorporate it into religion. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle also gives discussion to what a person with a great soul or what a virtuous person would look like. He goes through a long list. This is in the book. They do not take small risks. They do not esteem what is popular. They take few things very serious. They're not anxious. They do favors but are ashamed to receive them. They are frank in expressing opinions. They lead lives that they choose. They are not given to wonder, for nothing seems great to them. They don't complain, and so on. One form of virtue ethics is the Stoics, and this was a group of people that followed a philosophy till about the 3rd century AD. The term Stoic is often seen in our society as someone who actually doesn't have any emotion, someone who has no reaction to pain or pleasure or grief or joy. This is kind of a twisting of the word a little bit, because the Stoics themselves were actually part of virtue ethics. They just had a slightly different spin on the moral reasoning. Stoics believed that self-control and fortitude was a means of overcoming destructive emotions that can often bias us into our making the wrong decision or not the correct moral decision. For the Stoics, reason meant not only using logic, but also understanding the process of nature, the logos, or the natural reason, or the underlying meaning that is in everything. The Stoics did not seek to extinguish all emotions. Rather, they just thought that they could develop clear judgment and inner calm, and such methods of self-discipline could help them make better moral decisions. To the Stoics, their 4 cardinal virtues were wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. So they were very similar to a traditional virtue ethics, but this was more of a movement, and there were other similar movements occurring at the same time in Greek society. Just a quick glimpse into where Aristotle is today, because some of these terms may start to seem familiar. Aristotle introduced phrases such as "we are what we repeatedly do." So it goes back to this idea of moral training. We see this in the Golden Rule, do unto others. We understand this is a commonly used term in a great number of aspects of society. We also see it in codes of ethics, whether that be professional codes in the workplace, or things like the Boy Scouts and the Girl Guides codes of ethics that are used for young people to give them some sort of virtuous training. In business and management, we see it in training courses, where the assumption is that if leaders of big, large companies are given virtuous training, they'll do the right thing. The question, and there's no one true answer, is if we accept the approach of virtue ethics, that ethics can in fact be taught, then of course the logical next question is, how should it be taught? And what virtues should be emphasized? Now, virtue ethics, of course, is a very old approach, and it has gone through periods of popularity. More modern philosophies have actually adopted some of the other approaches we saw earlier in the presentations, deontology and consequentialism. And around the 1950s, virtue ethics and the theory itself got a resurgence through scholars such as Elizabeth Anscombe, who was critical of some of these other philosophies that seemed to allow any moral act of any kind if it brought about some sort of good end. She thought that the moral approaches had moved into too much of a consequent or an outcome kind of based thinking, and she thought about the ideas of virtue and human flourishing and wrote several works suggesting that there needed to be a revisiting of these ideas. Alistair MacIntyre reinforced these ideas a little bit later than Anscombe, and he said that in today's complex society there was what he called a moral vacuum. He wrote a book in 1981 called After Virtue, in which he said we should once again return to these virtue theories to help us understand the modern world. MacIntyre argued that living a virtuous life required two things: habits and intention. Habits, meaning you get into the habit of training yourself to be moral, and intention, that you desire to be virtuous and you make an effort to reach certain goals. He argued that habit and intention could give a person overall purpose and a sense of meaning. Another interesting aspect of MacIntyre's work is that he noticed that even though societies had developed for about 2,500 years, virtues may have changed too. So the foundations of virtue were still in place, but there needed to be an effort to maybe change the emphasis. He points out that the work of Homer in the Iliad and the Odyssey, the following virtues emerged: physical strength, courage, cunning, and friendship. These are called the Homeric virtues. And they rely on a lot to do with warfare, because during that time period, warfare was a very dominant way of different groups coming together. As a result, physical strength and courage were seen as very virtuous behaviors. To MacIntyre, as cities developed, life became more civilized, and while there was war, there was far less ongoing war and far less need for physical strength. There was also the emergence of philosophers who had more time to contemplate other virtues that were important for an individual and for society. MacIntyre calls these the Athenian virtues because they took place in Athens, and they took place with Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates. MacIntyre says that during this time in Athens, courage, friendship, temperance, wisdom, and justice emerged. Justice including retribution, in other words, you get what you deserve, do the crime, do the time, and also distributive justice, meaning that the goods of society were distributed fairly and no one was hoarding all the resources while other people starved. To MacIntyre, these were the most complete set of moral virtues, even though they dated back to ancient Greek. Since that time, ethics dealt with the Enlightenment and a movement towards science, when there became an increasing emphasis for the truth, while an abandonment of virtue. To MacIntyre, there needed to be a return to this consideration of virtue, because he said something was lost as a result. To MacIntyre, looking at virtue ethics in a modern day context, he boils it down to three important virtues: justice, courage, and honesty. These were the three most dominant virtues that he thought moral training should encourage. He thought we can only achieve moral excellence through practicing these three virtues, and that when used in terms of organizations, agencies, or institutions, they can prevent big groups such as organizations from becoming morally bankrupt. So we may think of white-collar crime and efforts to provide virtue training to those leading these companies. So not only do they make money, but they also serve a social function and they give back. To MacIntyre, if these institutions and their leaders are corrupt, then vices spread throughout the culture and morality simply disappears. McIntyre points out in a modern society we may be looking at three types of people, and this is a restriction on a movement towards happiness or eudaimonia. He points out that we have bureaucratic managers. These are people in business that aim to get resources and satisfy shareholders and focus on profits, but may not have much regard for employees or colleagues. They may even be a loving father or mother at home, but when they go to work, they leave their morals at home. He also highlights the rich ascete, who is compared to your fashionistas, people who you see icons, their expensive homes, on magazines. They're concerned for the next product or fashion, and this is a superficial approach to a life and not an attempt for happiness or morality. And the third group he calls the therapist, and this is a person that you see on the news or in mass media advocating what they call spiritual treatments, cosmetic surgery, new diets that actually have no therapeutic value, and there's promote an emptiness and a meaninglessness in today's society. Virtue ethics during this time period also took particular significance in an American context, and America's use of what they regard as important virtues. Following the groupthink that occurred in Nazi Germany, where people supported an immoral regime because it was what the group was doing, America in response emphasized individualism and a reluctance to engage in this type of group thinking. Of course, virtue ethics seeks to balance self-interest and group responsibility, but in the American context, there was definitely a movement towards individualism. This occurred in the baby boomers generation as well, when there was a large group of young people, and those young people were told to be individuals. It also can explain the virtue that rejects communism, which is seen as a return to this group way of thinking, and an emphasis towards individualism as a means to reject that. It reminds one of Martin Luther King, who says, "A good man does good work, but good works do not make a good man." Now, these virtues have been noticed by writers. There's one author who actually wrote The Virtues of Captain America, modern day lessons on character from a World War II superhero. So this is a hypothetical superhero that's been in movies and cartoons, but this philosopher wrote a book discussing the virtues that are associated with this icon in the American context. To this writer, Captain America represents the virtues of courage, humility, righteous indignation, sacrifice and responsibility, and perseverance. And he argues that they reflect the virtues in an American context that are seen as most important. So what are the strengths of virtue ethics? Well, first, it's easy to understand and to apply. The basic idea of training people to make the correct ethical decisions just seems to make sense, and trainings, whether it be the Boy Scouts or a CEO of a company, are very intuitive and logical. It also seems to make sense that with the correct training, it doesn't matter on the specific issue, but the person is in a position to make the correct decision, not based on what is necessarily legally right or wrong, but what is morally right or wrong. This can also help explain civil rights movements in which people like Martin Luther King and Gandhi were incarcerated and viewed as criminals when history has shown them to be doing the morally correct thing. It can explain that discrepancy. Virtue ethics is also has a strength that it recognizes the role of emotions in ethics. Of course, with the Stoics, they try to minimize the impact of emotions, but it does recognize that emotions can muddy the water when making ethical decisions, and training can help one harness those emotions and still get to a rational decision in a moral dilemma. What is the weaknesses? There's several weaknesses of virtue ethics. One is that several psychologists argue that there may actually not be anything called character traits, that this is actually a invented psychological concept that doesn't really exist. Two, the golden mean may not actually apply in all situations. And related to that, virtue ethics may not include the cultural differences in virtue. In other words, different cultures, different countries may actually have an emphasis on different virtues. A lot of virtue ethics explains there's different circumstances, but doesn't go into a lot of detail about how different countries may actually have different virtues. And the last weakness mentioned here is that decisions are often difficult. And in the book by Rachels and Rachels, they argue that virtue ethics remains incomplete because it can't account for the fact that being honest implies a rule. So other rule-based approaches, such as deontology, and the work of Immanuel Kant says that there is rules that we follow. Virtue ethics doesn't necessarily provide a rule, they provide ethical training and a moral approach. Whereas Rachels and Rachels in their book argue that being honest is in fact a rule. So what is the future of virtue ethics? Well, it's likely that it will continue to ebb and flow in its popularity. You will generally recognize when you see words such as moral character, virtuous character, and these are things that are not likely to go away anytime soon. As I said before, virtue ethics does not provide a sense of moral rules, do this, don't do that. It focuses on moral character in the individual and in the society. So you'll still see these approaches used in training sessions at all different levels and aspects of society and for all different groups. There will be continued efforts in virtue ethics in terms of decision making, and the virtues are often demonstrated by continuing to do virtuous action over time. So it's a self-testing moral approach, because on a daily basis you're encountered with a range of small and large moral dilemmas in which you have to negotiate. The golden mean is still an intricate part of society. That's not going to go anywhere anytime soon. And the future of virtue ethics will continue through explorations of virtuous exemplars. This includes historical examples, MLK, John F. Kennedy, Gandhi, these famous people who we see in very intense moral dilemmas, and we read stories and we reflect on how they dealt with it. It will also occur with exemplars in your personal life, people who you respect and you believe exhibit virtuous behaviors, and that you trust, respect their courage, and respect their virtues, and they serve as models or examples for you. One consideration for virtue ethics is there's a few quizzes online. This quiz is actually called the Sherwood Forest Quiz. So the first thing you do is try to forget any ideas about Robin Hood and the story. This is somewhat of a different story, but it's an interesting moral quiz to take. So here is the moral quiz, or the dilemma. The Sheriff of Nottingham catches Little John and Robin Hood and imprisons them in his maximum security dungeon. Maid Marian begs for the sheriff for their release, pleading her love for Robin. The sheriff agrees to release them only if Maid Marian spends the night with them. To this she says yes. The next morning the sheriff releases the prisoners. Robin asks that Marian tells him how she persuaded the sheriff to let him go. Marian told the truth and was bewildered when Robin said that he never wanted to see her again. At this point, Little John defended her, inviting her to leave Sherwood with him and promising a lifelong devotion. She accepted and they rode away together. So now, in terms of realistic everyday standards of behavior, put those four individuals in order from the most moral to the least moral. That is Robin Hood, Maid Marian, Little John, and the Sheriff. Rank them from most moral to least moral. Remember, there's no right answer, there's just a bunch of different combinations. Write down your answer in terms of Robin, Marian, Sheriff, and Little John and rank them. I've provided a link here in which you can go and see what your combination tells you about you. If the link no longer works, just put in Sherwood Forest Virtual Ethics Moral Test. Any of those keywords, you'll find the interpretation. It's a very interesting exercise in terms of virtue ethics.